right. Welcome, thank you. Thank you very much. Kind words, very kind words. So I'm gonna go ahead and jump in, make the most of our time. And I would like to talk to you today about dismantling stigma and how we can use some of the new recovery science to inform our efforts around that. This is something that everybody here is familiar with, right? We understand the concept of stigma. We've been dealing and working with this for years. You know, one helpful framework as well, just to put in the back pocket, is to understand the different levels that this is going to play out at. It's important that we start to have a degree of precision in our work and in our efforts. But at the end of the day, we know that there can be this public stigma, the self-stigma, and the structural level stigma. But from recently listening to a historian speak, I would say I agree. Stigma has a political and an economic function. And that's why, ultimately, it's persist. That's why it's harnessed and used. There are gains to be had for those who traffic in stigma. In our field, when it comes to addiction, though, what you need to know for sure up front, this is literally the most highly stigmatized condition in the world. This study, 14 countries, compared 18 conditions, whether it would have been having a criminal record or being HIV positive. Drug addiction was ranked by people to be the #1 most stigmatized. Alcohol addiction, #4, okay? So this is what we are up against. How on earth did we get here? First of all, let's just take a minute to understand what determines the extent of stigma for any condition. There's really 2 factors at play. One is going to be regarding the perceived cause, okay? Either it is their fault or it's not their fault, okay? Additionally, it's about the perceived controllability. They can't help it or they can help it. That's going to be what determines how stigmatized a certain condition is. It's going to lay at the intersection of both cause and controllability, okay? And that's why sometimes you see differences in the way different conditions are stigmatized, or even differences in stigma between mental health and substance use disorder, even along that route. But this stigma, this is both reflected and affected all through our facets of our society. So even if you start in healthcare, the treatment for substance use disorders was historically siloed away from mental health and other general health conditions. This is how we inherited this very uncoordinated and segregated treatment system, ultimately, is because it was not considered to be in a place that should be taken alongside other general health conditions. In fact, when they did that with HIV stood back and said, no, actually, we'll take a place right here in the middle of the infectious disease department. Thank you very much. But for us, how far you got to travel to the methadone clinic, right? Okay, that's a deflection of stigma and discrimination. When I show this picture, you know, the question, it's kind of like the game show host here, right? It's like, can you identify which of these facilities treat substance use disorders versus other health conditions? Most people can identify when they're here for other health conditions versus when we're here to get help with a substance use disorder, because the quality of the physical environment for people with substance use disorder tends to be a much lower standard sometimes. But the thing is, people with this disorder actually need a better quality of environment, because sometimes living with the disease of addiction has taken the dignity and the humanity away from them. And the environment is the first thing that they're greeted with. Our language is no exception. Language additionally reflects and affects stigma. We see non-medical moralistic terminology that became very pervasive, both in scientific settings and in medical settings. We would say that they have a dirty urine as opposed to the test coming back positive or negative is how a test can come back. We medically absolutely adopted the word drug abuser, even though we have moved away from that in the current DSM criteria. We now use to drug use disorder, mild, moderate, severe. But again, you can see how when it comes to conditions, if you look at our friends who might have an eating-related condition, right? We don't refer to them as being a food abuser, right? But we say they have an eating disorder, So this is why we have to start to question the terminology that we have inherited in this field. The media, definitely no exception. In fact, when Vanity Fair asked me my thoughts on the intervention, the show Intervention, that's been a long time in running on A&E about them coming back, I said, well, if we think about it, what other medical conditions have we normalized the use of public media exposure during a vulnerable and symptomatic time period in order to gain consent prior to treatment? That's a reflection, we don't do that often, but again, that is a reflection of the stigma on this condition, that we accept that and showing people publicly at their most vulnerable moments. Any credible conversation about drug policy would acknowledge the role of stigma against race as well. So not only the substance use in itself, but also within that, we have the issue of race. In fact, this historian who I was recently learning from, Dr. Roberts, he used the word race substance. Stigma is what was peddled often. You can see some of the earlier ripped from the headlines, news lines here, the Negro cocaine fiend, it became a trope. It became a trope in the papers. And you can see the way they talk about the Mexican, right? So this was peddled. You have to think about it. All drugs were once legal before they became illegal and regulated. And you have to ask yourself, well, then why and when did that happen? That is because drug policies were not based upon the benefits and harms of the drugs, as it should be in the federal schedule. They were based upon who was perceived to be associated with the drug use. And our drug use, it was generally perceived that it was socially and economically disadvantaged people, many of it targeted towards immigrants. It was our 1870s anti-opium laws. It was our 1910s and 1920s anti-marijuana laws. This is not information huddled in a corner in a specialized class on race. This was information I was taught in just a basic undergraduate class on drugs. This is how our drug policies came around, common knowledge, to the drug policy and the drug folks. And we certainly continue to see that as we moved up the timeline. In the 70s, it was this framework of the war on drugs, right? And we weren't thinking about it from a public health perspective at that time. And of course, we also peddled in stigma. I've explained there are things to be gained for people who peddle in stigma. And so we learned from one of Nixon's top aides. In the 90s, he did an interview, and he told us about what went on behind the scenes whenever they were putting together these extremely impactful federal drug policies. And sorry for all the text on this slide, but sometimes you just got to hear it from the horse's mouth, really. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to either be against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, we could, sorry, I lost my place. Lots of text, I told you, and hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt their communities, arrest their leaders, raid their homes, and break up their meetings, vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Highly effective. These are the policies, some of the policies that followed from that time era. We know that in 1986, we had an extremely impactful federal policy that implemented the no-knock warranty, no-knock arrests and things along that line. And today, we now have 70 Black and Latinx individuals make up 77% of those incarcerated in the federal system for drug crimes. It is important to understand that the war on drugs was planned, executed, and successful. And although we have often intellectually moved on from the war on drugs to the war on drugs, it is important to know that these people's lives have not. Continuing with the policy here, this is where also I'm starting to build the backdrop for my first study that I'd like to tell you about in this case. These types of policy discriminations, again, this is kind of like the news. It really informed and shaped my opinion as to why I wanted to study this amongst people in recovery. It says here, analysis of state laws permitting intoxication exclusion. So alcohol exclusion laws are in many states, and they allow your health insurance company to deny a claim if you show up for care and if they found that you have an unprescribed substance or alcohol in your system. There is no limit on alcohol, could be one drink. And the problem is that breaks up the continuum of care. When somebody shows up into the emergency department and we have an opportunity to link them to a peer, to take care of them, maybe talk about what we see, but instead our doctors are scared to administer the drug test to figure out what they need because they know they and their institution will not get paid. This is a form of discrimination. You know that the drug convictions were the only criminal conviction with the potential to impact student financial aid. This is why I call this discrimination. You could commit embezzlement, you commit murder, and still retain your eligibility for your financial aid. That is how stigmatized this condition is. These things were not given to us through criminal justice. Criminal justice does, whether it's incarceration, probation, parole, these were our policymakers coming down the line and finding a way to take away the rights of these people and probably reappropriate the money. We saw the same thing with nutritional assistance. A lifetime ban, federal government lifetime ban for nutritional assistance to those convicted of a felony drug crime for the rest of their lives. Many states have implemented laws to protect people from this, but last I knew, there are still a few that are honoring this lifetime ban. This is a reflection of having the #1 stigmatized condition in the world. And this is why I decided to take this up into the form of a study. When we did the National Recovery Study a number of years ago, we did a one-time online survey to people who had resolved a problem with alcohol and other drugs. Thousands of people were in this study. And part of the line of questioning that I asked focused on 2 different levels of discrimination. You have the micro levels of discrimination, you could call them. These are social, personal exchanges, insults, slights, derogatory statements. Is this something that happens to you? And then the macro level discriminations, violations of personal rights that occur at this structural, organizational, and policy level. The question at hand, how frequently has the following occurred to you because somebody knew about your alcohol or drug history? Keeping in mind, this is amongst people who have resolved a problem. And we know that this is, and this was at this time, it was nationally representative, balanced on US Census benchmarks, which yielded the prevalence rates in the country amongst people who were in recovery. And so that was one of the innovative things. Thanks to Faces and Voices, who actually did an early version of this study and started the ball rolling with this line of questioning as well. So what do we know about these? We know that these micro-discriminations, coming in at the highest was about 46% of people saying people assumed I was likely to relapse, 38% saying that they felt that they were held to a higher standard because somebody knew about their history with alcohol or other drugs, 33% of people in recovery saying I was disrespected, 35% saying people treated me less favorably, 20% saying I looked like an alcoholic or an addict. And this additional set of findings on the micro level, recovery-related discrimination, and the prevalence that this is occurring in the country, you can see about 31% saying that people avoided me because they knew about my history. People assumed I could not provide for myself, and people failed to trust me, right? And that I felt discriminated against. And then when it comes to the other level, right, the structural level regarding our rights, our resources, things along that line, to what degree was this happening here? We can see that there was about 15% of the population that said it's been hard for me to get health insurance because they knew about my history. I lost my job because somebody learned about my history. I was denied a loan or didn't even bother to apply. I put in there not even bothered to apply because I know plenty of people that are well aware they had lost their rights to Pell Grants at that point in time. So why would you bother to go through that process? I was denied food assistance. I left a recovery or addiction treatment environment. Yes, we do discriminate sometimes and have stigma in our own environments. And we are going to circle back around to that before the end of this conversation here today. 16% saying I was treated unfairly by the police. I received inadequate medical treatment. We knew that this was allowed. That's part of why this was in here. There were policies allowing these things to go on, right? And so the question is, to what degree? My insurance would not cover some of my medical cost, 10%. I could not get a job, or I had a job and I could not get a promotion. I was denied the right to vote. Yes, you can lose your right to vote if you're caught with drugs and alcohol. So the next question is, does it matter? Yeah, it matters. One, it should matter in and of itself. And second of all, it mattered because individuals who reported experiencing this type of discrimination, it was associated with more psychological distress, lower quality of life, refers to your satisfaction with your ability to achieve your daily goals, lower recovery capital as well. The final follow-up question that I asked regarding this, and as we said, any conversation regarding drug policy can also acknowledge the role of race. Was there any racial or ethnic differences in that? And the first thing, full disclosure on this one, I did this analysis for the Society on Alcoholism. So at this point, I'm going to show you the over 50% of people who had alcohol as the primary substance. So we're going to do a little switch, and then we're going to look at the results here. The first thing I'll show you is that I'm jumping right into the macro level. Why is that? Because there were no racial differences in the experiences of microaggressions. Okay, so in this point, it's looking at, we saw the prevalence levels, and everybody's enduring that about the same way. But when it came to the macro level, the structural and the policy level, this is where it was the same for everybody, with the exception of one group, individuals that identified as Black. Individuals that identified as Black were 3 times as likely to say that they left a recovery or a treatment environment. They also were twice as likely to say they lost their job because somebody knew about their history, and 3 times as likely to say that they had been denied housing. And finally, they were 3 times as likely to say they couldn't get a job, 4 times as likely to say they had a job, but they could not get a promotion. This is an indicator to us. This is consistent with what the National Institute of Health is telling us, how health inequities are created. It's less so about the unfortunate insults, slights, and derogatory statements. Health inequities are baked into the process. They're baked into the process. It's the structural level components which are disproportionately affecting certain individuals. And so it's important to know that by the year 2055, there'll be no single racial ethnic majority in this country, okay? So we need to anticipate increasing diversity in all of the work we do. We need to reissue permits, right, in terms of access to higher education, nutritional assistance, housing, voting, employment. These are the levers we can pull to change the landscape of recovery, and we need to change the narrative on how our institutions are magnifying harm from disorder as opposed to minimizing harm and promoting recovery. All too often in the science, I see mechanisms of health disparities studied at the individual level. Is it their motivation? Is it their this? Is it their that? No, it is their condition. It is the policies. It's the structural level. That is a mechanism of health disparities. So let's go ahead and talk about stigma, some of the things that have came along the way that have helped move us to a different place, and then some of the things that we can also take home today to help us continue to move to a different place. It was quite some time ago, actually. Now, it was 2020 that this study was published. And one of the things that this author did, who also at one point in time led the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, he, for the first time, laid out you could call them relapse rates, you could call them rates of recurrence, alongside other chronic health conditions, and said, do you see? Here we are about 40, 60%. Here it is for hypertension, and here it is for asthma. So at this time, the medicalization movement helped to reduce stigma by comparing these to other chronic illnesses. And although there have been some fruitful conversations since then that is this the right condition to compare it to, et cetera, this was very helpful for amplifying the public health component that was missing from our criminal justice, this is a social problem response. And the recovery movement, well, they were on the scene, right? They were on the scene before medicine. That's why recovery support services popped up, because medicine was not tending to the patient with a substance use disorder. And so this movement additionally allowed us to reduce stigma in this area. You know, when we think about the construct of recovery, it is becoming validated amongst scientists, the medical community, government communities. You know, historically, we were often governed by the medical field in terms of our outcomes primarily would have been a negative drug screen, abstinence, maybe reductions in use, or the reduction in remission, which is a reduction of symptomology. But we know that recovery is more than just the absence. I call these the absence of something types of absence of pathology, the absence of disease. But recovery is about the presence of something, the presence of health, the presence of well-being. And this began to destigmatize and shape the way that this disorder was looked at. And there has now begun a movement. We were exclusively focused on pathology. And you can see it even in the terminology and the way that we worked. But now we're learning that we do need to incorporate strength-based approaches, strength-based assessments. We're going to talk not just about remission, but we're going to talk about recovery, resilience. We're not going to just look at the risk factors. We're going to take stock of the protective factors. We're not going to just look at what's broken. We want to know what they are doing that is adaptive. We're not just going to talk about problems. We want to talk about advantages, not just disease, but health. Right? And so this is how the recovery movement has come along and reshaped in a validated and substantial way. And the impact of that has definitely been to reduce stigma. Now, this paradigm shift, we have tried to usher this in at the Recovery Research Institute. And I just, in a fun way, call them recovery vital signs. But formalizing the use of strength-based indicators into the research designs, into the outcomes. We want to know about their ability to perform their daily living activities and their perceptions of that. Their recovery capital, right? Their sum total assets, resources needed to initiate and sustain recovery. In theory, these are all of the resources that somebody would need. We care about their self-esteem. We care about their happiness. But people weren't paying attention to what was going on at this level when we're only focused on things like a negative drug screen. So we want to take these recovery vital signs and we're going to move the science forward by answering some very key questions. We want to know who needs what type of service, when in their recovery, for what duration, and what intensity. And we want to do this by adding in recovery vital signs. So we took a step in this direction when we did the National Recovery Study. I already introduced the idea of this study. Thousands of people in this one-time cross-sectional interview. We had people in this study who had just resolved a problem with alcohol and drugs a week ago, and some people 40 years ago we have here. And what we're going to see here is we're going to look at these recovery vital signs. You can see down by where it starts at the 0, meaning they just resolved a problem with alcohol or other drugs. All these strength-based indicators start lower, but you can see the growth. Exponential at times, and then increasingly linear over the 40 years. This is the evidence that recovery happens. This is the evidence that you get to tell people life does get better. Hang in there. You're the evidence. This is the evidence. I've got CEOs that want a poster of this on their walls for their patients and every employee to see, right? Because what happens is we only end up seeing maybe a piece on the continuum of care that we work. Some people are only in detox. Some folks are looking more at long-term recovery, but this is really what you're a part of. And that one line that starts high and gets low is psychological distress, right? Life gets better. And it's not just because you get older, because we controlled for age. We controlled for age. This is recovery. right? And we've got evidence of it. But I want to show you a closer look at what happens around 2 years, because this is what you cannot see. We have a dip happening in recovery vital signs, and it's happening around 6 months to 1 year. People, growth and recovery, and it is important to shape expectations, particularly among our medical providers and everybody, that this is not a linear process, all right? So we do not want to look at the people we serve and start to wonder, why is this not working for you? And what is wrong with you? And why haven't you cured yourself? Our evidence shows us that people are going to feel worse at 1 year out than they did on day one. This is what was missing, right? This is what's missing when we only look at negative drug screens. And why aren't you getting better, right? We know now that they're not. We can prepare for this. If we know that this is happening, then we can prepare for this. Again, who needs what, when, in their recovery? This is what we're going to try to start to get at here. I want to go ahead and take a look, because you can chop up the data by primary substance, and we want to see how their recovery vital signs are doing. You can see on one side, I've got quality of life, and on the other side, recovery capital. What you need to look here is see that depending on their primary substance, it is not the same for everybody. You will see here that individuals with a primary opioid use disorder, and the other category is mostly stimulants. So you're looking at opioid and stimulant use disorders who are coming in much lower right off the bat compared to alcohol and cannabis. Who needs what when? They need access to resources quick, fast, and upfront. Okay? It is going to take them 2 to 3 years before their recovery vital signs return to that of their colleagues who are seeking recovery from alcohol, who are seeking recovery from cannabis. And I can tell you, it is a room full of experts right here. I'm sure you can speculate on why maybe some of this is happening, right? The data can't always tell you why, right? But it can tell you that it's happening. And I know you have some thoughts. I know you have some thoughts about that. I also think it is important to highlight that we've identified some recovery vital signs amongst individuals who identify as sexual minorities versus non-sexual minorities. This is about 12% of the folks in our study. And the thing is when we look here at the 40-year horizon, they are at, things are not going in the same direction. You can see that for quality of life, psychological distress, there's differences, happiness, there's differences. Their self-esteem around 30 years is going in the wrong direction. Why is that? We need work here. We need work here, okay? And the recovery capital, again, is at a distinct advantage. We want recovery for all. We don't want people left behind. And so we need to know who needs what, when. And these recovery vital signs are giving us a clue as to what to anticipate that we need to be addressing. And the last way that we've kind of cut the pie here is to ask, how are folks doing according to their racial or ethnic background? On the 5-year horizon, we're looking here individuals that were identified as mixed race and Native American. You can see quality of life starts to go in the opposite direction at 5 years. Their psychological distress was higher, and again, happiness starts to trend downward. I do find that interesting because as I look at some of the science that's getting funded at the National Institute of Health and other funders, I'm seeing more proposals coming in to study mixed-race individuals, which means they're detecting in their data what we're detecting here in our data. This is a marker for something, and there's work to be done here. Let's sum it up. So this recovery curve, the idea of looking at some recovery milestones. This is what was missing from the science before, is what do we know about recovery milestones? Well, we know that initially there's this kind of convalescence. We got good at this initial period. This is when we've got detox. We got good at putting out the fire, right? Medical detox and clinical stabilization. Individuals may have a degree of support at this time, treatment support, recovery support, support from family. But those 6, 7, 8 months or so, those are the hardest time. Okay, that's going to be the hardest time, and their growth is not linear. They could feel worse on day one than they do on day two. But than they do at the beginning. But after that time period, there starts to be a climb. Right? My boss calls it the industrial revolution. What we need to be doing at this time is giving people access to building materials to rebuild their lives, access to their recovery capital that they need, and we need to be willing to reissue building permits. Yes, you are allowed to get nutritional assistance. We would like you to go ahead and vote. Yes, going to college might be a great idea for you, but we have to allow people to rebuild their lives. We weren't as good at that part, right? We became good at the treatment. We became good at clinical stabilization, but we haven't as well gotten to the point where we are good at providing the architectural materials to build the recovery. You know, and this has direct implications for recovery community, for recovery support services. We have now and the science is emerging on this as well. We know that we can extend and diversify the continuum of care to catch people who we wouldn't even otherwise catch in a healthcare system sometimes. We've got digital technologies we need to be researching. We've got peer specialists working in many different types of environments. My goodness, how can we keep up? That field has exploded. We've got collegiate recovery programs. We've got recovery high schools. Recovery housing has very strong effects. Can a doctor give a evidence-based referral to recovery housing? Yes, indeed they can, says my systematic review of the literature. And these recovery community centers, I call these the Amazon shopping of recovery. People say, what do they do? I say, what don't they do? Recovery community centers. And as I explained just a bit earlier, at 12 o'clock, this is an exciting time for recovery community centers. We are learning that although it takes 15 years for quality of life to return to that to the general population for people who didn't have a substance use disorder, our studies are finding that people who use these centers are hitting that quality of life at 5 years. 5 years. Imagine if you are accelerating the recovery vital signs, preventing the dip, maybe even growing linear fashion. My goodness, right? But this is also why, for those of you who are, and I know that you have a lot of hats that you wear when you're looking at your data and your evaluations and all that stuff, and you're wondering, why didn't it grow? Why did it only stay the same? Well, they were going to dip without you, okay? But you don't have a comparison group, and that's not your job. That's my job. But this is why we study this, right? So sometimes if you can just keep the gains that maybe they got, right, and keep them steady, you're working. You're right, you're helping. It's working, okay? And this is just one slide I put together here because I find that, the treatment industry, where everybody's familiar with the treatment industry, they don't understand our recovery ecosystem, though. And I get emails, phone calls. I want to open a recovery community center, but they tell me there's already treatment here, so why? So I stole this slide from my colleague Brandon Bergman, made some adaptations, and I said, take this information for when you're trying to write your grants, when you're trying to explain what you're doing so you have the language that you can tell them. The goals of treatment are different, with their focus on symptomology, pathology, right? Our recovery support services, we're going to be eliminating and addressing socio-political determinants of health. We're going to be building recovery capital, which includes social support and all the things underneath that umbrella. They vary in their time frames. We saw the dip. You don't pull back services after 12 weeks. That's how long we run clinical trials on average, 12 weeks, okay? You don't disappear at 12 weeks. They vary in their location. This is how we hope to help with health equity issues. We cannot expect people to come in to the hospital. I barely make it into work to the hospital every day. I don't know how somebody with a health condition makes it into Mass General every day. You have to go to their communities where they live, work, play. You work there. You make connections with their stakeholders in their community. And you build trust. And because you lead with peers, you are going to evade some of the medical mistrust that has built up with the medical community. That's why peers have a way of helping with equity issues. And the providers are different. One is therapist, one is peers. This is not treatment. So we covered that the recovery movement helped to destigmatize by framing a pathology-based condition with strengths approaches, health, well-being, and the recovery science has emerged to add a precision that we can use to inform our services, where we build, what we build, who needs what for what intensity and duration. I'm going to give you a few take-home tools as well. And so let's talk about the utility of our language. This is something that we can start thinking about right away. And I'd like to approach language from an evidence-based point, because we certainly all have our ideas of things that should or should not, or does it matter, right? The way we talk, but let's find out. Let's look at the science, and is there any evidence for it? Well, I'm going to show you today that the language we use can have a measurable impact on people's perceived need for punishment when you have a substance use disorder, as well as the blame and the perceived likelihood of their recovery. So back in 2010, John Kelly, who's the founder of the Recovery Research Institute, he ran this study to figure out, does it even matter how we refer to individuals with substance-related conditions? And often studies like this are done through what we call vignettes. So it's when I give you a story to read. Everybody has a story. The only difference is I give this half of the room the story, then change one word compared to this half of the room. And then I measure outcomes. That's how a lot of language studies are done. In this case, here was the scenario, and he did this study amongst clinicians, okay? So we're looking at people who work in the field. I said we were going to come back to this. Mr. Williams is a substance abuser and is attending treatment program through the court. As part of the program, Mr. Williams is required to remain abstinent from alcohol and other drugs. In the second condition, it is the exact same, except Mr. Williams has a substance use disorder. The results of this study is we learned that compared to the clinicians in the substance use disorder condition, those with substance abuser agreed more with the idea that the individual was personally culpable and needed punishment. That is the measurable impact of our language right there. So, abuser implies a more willful misconduct. Perhaps it is their fault. A substance use disorder, medically speaking, at least that's what they call it over there, implies more of a health condition. Okay? So substance abuse is technically out of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It is substance use disorder, mild, moderate, severe. Okay? And it's evidence like this that got us there, which reminds me, actually, when I was covering my study about access to Pell Grants in college, when I published that study, that law was in effect, and today that law is gone. Okay? So thank you to everybody in recovery who helps science. Last study I'm going to show you with today. Again, this is a vignette study, and the question that was asked here was, what about the ways of describing drug-related impairment specifically? This is for opioid use disorder specifically. And when Dr. Kelly did this study, he did it in a nationally representative sample, right? So we've got a strong sampling base here. And as I explained, the vignettes are the exact same, but we're going to rotate out one word to figure out what can we learn about our language. And we compared, some of these words are not things that would be in your everyday vocabulary, but they are, some of our funders are using the terminology, and so we need to investigate, right? And so chronically relapsing brain disease, or just brain disease, or just disease, illness, disorder, or problem. I think I tried to get him to put health condition in there, and it did not make the cut. But this is ultimately what we were being tested. Let's take a look at the vignette, right? Alex was having serious trouble at home and work because of their increasing opioid use. And now that they're in treatment, sorry, I'm having trouble reading that over here. I'm going to look over this way here. And an increasing opioid use. They're now in a treatment program where they're learning from staff that their drug use is best understood as a blank, insert the term, that often impacts multiple areas of one's life. Alex is committed to doing all that they can to ensure success following treatment. In the meantime, they've been asked by their counselor to think about what they learned regarding to understanding their opioid use as a blank, right? So this is the vignette that thousands of people have read, and we put different terminology in there. And the results of this, I'd love to tell you they're just straightforward, but it's not completely straightforward. It depends on what the goals of your conversation are. So in the case that we're trying to minimize blame attribution, the language that most likely to do that is that type of biomedical language, right? It was chronically relapsing brain disease that reduced blame, or a brain disease That reduced blame. But on the flip side of that, it did the opposite for hope, optimism, and the likelihood of recovery. So this is how we're learning advances in our science, right? If the goal of this conversation is to increase the likelihood of optimism, hope, and recovery, the biomedical terminology is the one that doesn't do that, right? It was the word problem that was associated with the most hope, the most optimism. And it was also associated with a decreased perceived dangerousness, okay? And so now this is how we continue to advance our science, So is there one right answer? I think you just need to know what the goals of your conversation are. Maybe if you're in a medical setting, I would be the one grabbing the biomedical terminology, and when I'm outside of that, I'm probably not going to speak that way, right? So that's what we learned from that nationally representative study about language, and something that we can put in our back pocket today. Problem helps do that. Even the word disorder helped to increase recovery, but the word problem more so. Then, it wasn't a straightforward answer. We're threading a needle here, as you can see, trying to make a measurable impact. That's why we have the dictionary at recoveryanswers.org. It's one of our most popular resources. Additionally, I'll say while you're there, you really should sign up for the bulletin. We put a lot of work into it. We got a team full of scientists that summarize the current research, translate it for you, put new graphs that aren't hard to read, and write the implications for family, recovery support providers, treatment providers, and policymakers. And so it's an easy way to just keep up with what's going on as well. So wrapping it up and bringing it all home, we started a place where we talked about the stigma interventions. And this is consistent with the National Academy of Sciences did a huge report on stigma. And I'm going to extract the main findings for you. Stigma interventions should target structural stigma. Right? We also saw in my study of recovery-related discrimination, that was the mechanism of health disparity. It was at the structural level that is creating inequities. And on the individual level, what we do should target the perceptions of dangerousness and unpredictability. That's according to the National Academies of Sciences. And the language study that I just showed you that when you're talking to people, if you refer to it as their substance use disorder, if you choose to adopt the word problem, that was associated with decreased perceived dangerousness, right? We looked at the recovery vital signs. We learned about the dip coming down around 1.5 and 2 years. We know that opioid and stimulant use disorders are starting lower on recovery vital signs. That was recovery capital and quality of life, and it's taking them 3 years to get to their counterparts in recovery from alcohol and cannabis. We also looked at the differences on the 40-year horizon that sexual minorities are experiencing, as well on the 5-year horizon for individuals of mixed race and Native Americans. And as far as the language goes, we saw that biomedical terminology, it does reduce blame, but it did not increase recovery, optimism, and hope. Right? And so it's the non-medical terminology that will do that, along with decreased perceptions of dangerousness. Thank you very much. That sounds great. Thank you. I did not know the time. Thank you. Okay, cool. Thank you. Great. Oh, thank you. Thank you. We've got a few minutes, and so I'm happy to hear comments, thoughts, reactions, questions, anything at all, actually.
And so there's 3 microphones right up at the front here. So if you have Q&A, please come to the front and use one of the mics.
I'm so ready for the questions. I'm all excited. So I love, I've heard some of this before, but I love there's just more pointed sort of information in here that I really appreciate. So I'm about to present at 2:30 about how our internal stigma is perpetuating stigma in the greater community through the way that we use our stories. And so I would love, you mentioned it very quickly about how we're perpetuating, like the stigma is baked into our systems and that we're creating ourselves. And so I would love to hear more if there's been more research or any thoughts you have about the ways that our own stigma is impacting stigma as in the larger context.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really rich question. And I love that we get to backtrack to that for a second and talk, because You know, when it comes to thinking about individual level language and stigma, you know, one of the first things that comes to mind with me is that some of our language that we've learned came from credible resources that are very effective. If we look at AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, you got to know that they produce rates of continuous abstinence that is higher than frontline treatment, okay? And we know and are familiar with the language of AA. Right? Does that mean I'm going to bust up into AA and try to tear that party down? No. AA knows what they're doing. So in that regard, you know, I think that it's important that we understand the setting we're in, you know, and the hat that we wear. You know, so today, as we sit amongst each other, we're not in an AA meeting. I'm speaking to you as professionals and colleagues in the field, right? That's the hat that I'm wearing. And so today, I choose to use and adopt that terminology in this forum. But at the same time, I'm also going to I'm not here to take down something that we know is working as well as it is like AA. And so I think that's one example of this boundary of language, where we want to use it, how we want to use it. And, you know, and something that I like, that an example that I feel like I've learned from my boss, John Kelly, is that he's authored many language studies. In fact, it's contributed to even our scientific guidelines of the way we're allowed to talk about it in research. And the thing is that although he has worked deeply in that field, I have never heard him correct another person mid-sentence, ever. He leads by example. And it's his job to edit our papers as we publish them. And so there, you'll get his feedback, but I've never heard him cut anybody off mid-sentence in trying to correct their language. And so I feel like that's how I've learned about what do we do with these findings exactly. And so I would think about where you're at, who you're talking to, as well as sometimes maybe leading by example, right? So thank you for giving me the opportunity to kind of step into that, right? Thank you. Any other, is that something out there?
Hello, my name is Sarko Jerjerian. I'm a police lieutenant, a psychedelic-assisted psychotherapist, and advocate. And very happy to be here and hear what you said. And I had a question for you. The model that we developed in my community, we don't put artificial boundaries around the relationships that are made with the helpers on my team. So the recovery coach isn't told, you have 3 months, you have 6 months, you have 1 year. And I think your research indicates the importance of the old school mentorship that lasts a lifetime. And how do we convince insurance companies to stop requiring a diagnosis with a 3-month shell, a 6-month shell, and you're out, and you got to circle back and beg and plead for more money? Human beings are relational, and that lasts a long time. What can we do with what you have?
Thank you for bringing critical issues. And the fact that you work in criminal justice, my goodness, that was our primary response to substance use. So very important that we address these things as well. You know, when it comes to third-party payers, right? Third-party payers, insurance company, and those efforts generally start with Medicaid, which is why I'm so excited that Patrick Kennedy is speaking tomorrow, because he is an advocate for getting these things covered. One of the things that I'll tell you that has changed so far and what we see on the horizon, the idea of recovery capital, okay? When recovery capital hit the scene, it used to be recovery resources introduced by Cloud, White. And the thing is that, 15, 20 years ago, William White was trying to explain to us how we're going to use recovery capital to place patients differently. Are going to consider their severity, but we're also going to consider their level of assets and resources. Fast forward 15, 20 years, here we are. There are plenty of assessments of recovery capital out there. Felicia, where are you at? You're working on one right now, right, with qualitative. Okay, so I have the BARC 10 item. It's a very brief assessment. It's the opposite. Sometimes they can be comprehensive. I have a very brief assessment. I think it's because of the brevity of that first, and I'm getting to criminal justice, that now, very recently, in the latest edition of the American Society of Addiction Medicine placement criteria that came out in the fall, ASAM placement criteria, which is the most widely used, guess what's in there? Recovery capital, including my assessment. The idea here is that now they're going to build it into their assessments, track it, and refer to recovery support services to support that dimension. Where we're at with that is it's not mandated that providers assess for it. When insurance companies ask for it, it will start to be mandated. I have a number of states right now that, and Medicaid, that are using my recovery capital assessment, like Pennsylvania, okay? There in Medicaid, they have started using it, okay? So what's happening now is the recovery movement is starting to take a hold and define for ourselves what not only our outcomes, but the process is. Recovery capital is a process that leads to the ability to reduce substance use, that leads to maybe the initiation of a remission, right? And so we have a seat at the table now that is becoming more formalized, that's saying the narrative is not just about negative drug screens, the narrative is not just about some of the barriers that he was identifying, but we also have to focus on other things that we define, and it's also going to be about recovery capital. So that's some of my insights into how that has started to actually change. Thank you. Another question?
Yes. My name is Kyle Hanshaw. I'm a CPRC from Michigan out of Peer 360 Recovery Alliance. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are. You had a slide up there about recovery vital signs, and it showed a dip after about 3 years in both quality of life and recovery capital. I'm just curious as to what your thoughts are on why that would be.
Sure. Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, there was a couple of different dips along the way, and I'll tell you what. So for the one for the entire population, which was nationally representative study of people who had resolved a problem with alcohol or other drugs, we saw a dip happening. That was happening around year one. The big implication from that is that this is obviously not the time to pull back services, okay? And that's what we need to educate third-party payers on. And our field on, that we have to extend and diversify this treatment system that was built off brief episodic care. I think that part of what is happening at this time is, there is, I think for the first time, they're looking back in a way and they can see that they weren't able to see before. Look what I have to clean up. Look what I have to do. It's an alarming time period, right? It is an alarming time period. And maybe some of that initial help and support that you had along the way has started to fade as it's become normalized. Do not underestimate the importance and the role of post-acute withdrawal symptoms, okay? I know that we often are told and we see how people endure them for weeks, but I will tell you that people will endure them for a year, if not longer. I believe that that dip is actually highly associated with post-acute withdrawal symptoms. This was a sample of everybody who was in recovery, but I know that we lose people at that dip. In fact, when I was speaking in Michigan once, there was a girl, there was a person in recovery who was sharing her story. She was in recovery from injection drug use, and she said, every time I get to about 2 years, I just think, well, what else is there? She was bringing to life the words, what we are seeing in the data. We are losing people when their recovery vital signs dip. But I do believe that post-acute withdrawal symptoms have something to do with what's going on there. We know that post-acute withdrawal symptoms are indicative, are risky because it can lead to 2 pathways to recurrence of use due to post-acute withdrawal symptoms. People have a down-regulated system due to low dopamine levels during this time. This means they have an increased sensitivity to stress during this time period. It additionally means that they have a low ability to experience normal levels of reward, right? Eating dinner, going to sleep, right? Being with social people. Trying to experience the reward from that is very challenging. It is those 2 pathways that lead to a recurrence of use. And I think that that dip has something to do with the rebalancing that is trying to happen in their bodies at that time. So thank you for the question and welcome. About 3 minutes left. If there's anything else that we want to touch on. All right.
Hi.
Thank you. Yeah.
One of the challenges that in growing a recovery community organization is with funders, they use a certain language. And then I have the language that I like to use, but I feel obligated to use their language because I'm asking them for funding.
Yep.
Do you know how to, could you speak to approaching that?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I've definitely heard, of this problem going on where we have to play with our language in order to address our funders, and I think that it's important that we not let perfection get in the way of progress, okay? And so when we have an ally, and a hand in support, if you can think that the progress that we can make, even though it won't be perfect, can still be harnessed upon and capitalized, I encourage people to move in that direction. So, thank you. Good. Anything else you want to talk about today? All right. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you.